Business School at Gonzaga University. And I want to welcome you to our annual Mozilo Family Lecture. Tonight, the topic is housing affordability. Our lecture is brought to us by the Mozilo Chair of Business Administration, ably occupied by Professor Danielle Xu, a professor of finance at Gonzaga, and of course, the School of Business Administration. Before we get going tonight, I would ask for a moment of reflection and silence for the victims and those affected by the tragedy and the murders in Atlanta yesterday. And may we all work in our own way to reduce the amount of hate that exists in our world today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to tonight's moderator, Adriane Leithauser. Adriane is one of the finest we have in the business school, an outstanding lecturer in business ethics and a wonderful colleague. So Adriane, take it away.
Thanks so much, Dean Anderson, and thank you, Dr. Xu. And I'd also like to extend a thanks to AJ Hawk, without whom none of our events would go off nearly as well, or maybe at all. So thank you both so much. I'd like to start tonight with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of the Jesuit practice of composition of place, we acknowledge that Gonzaga University resides on the unceded and traditional homelands of the Spokane tribe of Indians. This land holds the spirit of the first people of this place, the people of the river. It is their ancestors who are here and bring forth the power of this place, the knowledge that comes from the land. We are grateful to be on this land and ask for its support as we work to manifest our intentions during this gathering of hearts, minds, and spirits. If you're joining us from outside of the region, I encourage you to visit native-land.ca to learn about the history of the land that you inhabit. So I'm really excited to be here to moderate this panel. I'll have a couple of logistics at the start and explain the format, and then try to stay out of the way of our great panelists that we have here. That'll be part of my job. But part of my passion around affordable housing and why Dr. Xu asked me to be the moderator is because, in addition to being a professor at Gonzaga, teaching business ethics in the School of Business, I also currently chair the City of Spokane's Community Housing and Human Services Board and Affordable Housing Committee. So this is also work that I've been deeply engaged in. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. I want to start by introducing our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Terri Anderson, who's been working at the Tenants unit of Washington State since it opened its Spokane office in 2013, organizing tenants in HUD Section 8 project-based buildings for housing preservation. The Tenants Union now operates 4 walk-in clinics and conducts monthly tenant meetings and organizes tenants to lead their fight for housing justice. Prior to working for housing justice, Terri worked primarily with Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, first serving local Indigenous communities and then coordinating multicultural student services at Spokane Community College. Terri has also been a union organizer, conducted community outreach for police accountability, and has served as a longtime member for S.H.A.W.L Society, which is a grassroots environmental justice. Originally from northwestern Washington, Terri earned her bachelor's degree at Washington State University before moving to Spokane, where she's now organizing for housing justice. Our second panelist is Jonathan Mallahan, who is an alum of Gonzaga and holds a bachelor's in political science. He's worked in a variety of leadership roles with the city. In fact, I had an opportunity to work with Jonathan when he was working with the city. And he led efforts to end homelessness, empower neighborhoods, and support a vibrant economy. Jonathan's current position is as the Vice President of Housing for Catholic Charities of Eastern Washington. In this role, he's responsible for the development and operation of Catholic Charities of Eastern Washington's housing portfolio. Catholic Charities operates over 1,400 units of affordable housing, serving people who have experienced homelessness, seniors, and families. And last but not least, Ben Steckert is the Executive Director of the Spokane Low Income Housing Consortium and Chair of the Regional Continuum of Care. He previously served for 8 years as the Spokane City Council President. He's also an alum of Gonzaga, undergraduate and master's degree from GU. And like me, Ben was born and raised in Spokane, so a couple of lifelong residents pretty passionate about housing justice. The topic tonight is affordable housing, which is an urgent issue for many cities, including Spokane. Spokane's growing, which could be a great thing, but there are factors straining our housing supply that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. With this growth, for example, house prices and rents push upward. Average house sales prices are up nearly 20% in the last year, and over 50% of renters are already stretched thin with housing costs exceeding 30% of their incomes. That is if they can find a place to rent. Rental vacancies been less than 2% for a number of years. And we're facing down the end of the eviction moratorium at the end of the month. These pressures disproportionately impact our low to middle income neighbors and members of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. For example, 74% of respondents with children to a recent survey conducted with our nearby Northeast neighbors are worried about staying housed, 74%. And an indication of the impending economic crisis and its systemically racist roots is that when you look at Avista's residential utility delinquency map, you'll find it overlaps nearly exactly with Spokane's old redlining maps. These are just a few examples. Tonight's guest will help us understand Spokane's current housing climate and help identify solutions for keeping housing affordable. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, who's going to give us a framework as we move forward talking about this issue.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight, and happy St. Patrick's Day. And I want Mark Johnson's background with the big GU flag in the background. So go Zags as well if I forget. Got a big weekend coming up. I think Adriane hit some of the points. We need to really be clear and repeat it over and over that there is a housing crisis. It's not, oh, some prices are rising and it's going to fix itself. This problem is not going to fix itself. If you're homeless in Spokane right now and you need housing and you go through the coordinated entry program and you do every single thing right, and say you qualify at Spokane Housing Ventures, which has 1,000 units in Spokane, their wait list for housing is 4 years. You can wait up to 4 years in Spokane if you need low-income housing. Rents are rising at double digits, but if you live in a rental unit in Spokane and somebody buys your units that you're living in and wants to build more expensive or a taller building, there are absolutely zero mitigation placements right now. There are no mitigation efforts. You are just kicked out of your apartment. There are no protections if somebody doesn't like you and they're your landlord. We have home prices that rise, and that's a lack of supply in our housing market. So housing it's not an easy issue. It's not something that you just say, this is the one thing we're going to do. It's complicated. And I like to think of housing as a stool that has 3 legs. And for the stool to stand, each leg must be stable. If one of those legs is not stable, then the stool falls down. And that's where we often get ourselves into problems when we say one of those legs is low-income housing, and that's subsidy. And you must have subsidized rent for people at the bottom of our market, and you must have subsidy to build because it's not profitable to build low-income housing. We also must offer services to those people in those housing. The second is rental protections. Renters need a variety of protections to keep them in their home and also to keep them stable. And if that leg is missing, the stool falls. And finally, there's our regulatory framework. Regulations define who we build, who can build what, and who can build where. If your zoning or your growth management is not dialed in correctly, you stifle the market and create scarcity of market rate homes and market rate apartments, which then kills the other leg of the stool. We must tackle each of these, and Jonathan and Terri and I will each address one area. But we all agree also that each must be done in a just manner. And Adriane touched upon this as well. Housing justice argues that you must have mitigation measures in place to stop the harmful displacement that occurs when a neighborhood gentrifies. Housing justice argues that you must develop policies that must acknowledge the harmful effects of redlining and address them when you change policies. You must look at policies that foster mixed income neighborhoods and do not foster segregation by income levels. Each of these historical wrongs must not be perpetuated as we rush to look to increase housing and address the current crisis. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Terri, who's going to give you some history and talk about rental protections and tenant protections.
Hi, I'm Terri Anderson, and I'm the director of the Spokane office for the Tenants Union of Washington.
We're going to have Jonathan get us started. I think Terri might have been kicked off and is going to come right back. Oh, the fun of Zoom. Jonathan.
I'm happy to get us started, though I don't know that I'll be as eloquent as Terri will be when she describes tenant protections and why they're so important to this three-legged approach to a housing ecosystem that Ben has described. I really want to address tonight a little bit about subsidized housing and why that's always going to be a part of a healthy housing system. Subsidized housing is really intended for people who are the most vulnerable in our community. These are people who have live with disabilities, who have suffered trauma in their lives and are struggling with the impacts of that trauma in their adulthood. These are folks that you should not expect are going to be able, in the economy that we have, to be able to support themselves and be able to afford the ever-increasing costs of housing. And that's really where Catholic Charities specializes. So Catholic Charities, we operate 1,400 units of housing across Eastern Washington. We really focus on the most needy in our communities, those who have the highest barriers to successful, sustainable housing. And what we see when people are housed are outcomes that benefit the entire community. So this is there isn't just an ethical or a moral argument for why we should house people. And for some of you who are familiar with Catholic faith traditions, you may know that I think it was in 1987, Pope John Paul II in an encyclical called out housing as an integral piece of human dignity. It's not a nice to have, it's a necessity for human dignity and well-being. And that's where we come from at Catholic Charities. So our housing is structured in a way that's called low barrier housing. A lot of landlords are in the industry to make money. And there's a place for that. We need a profit incentive for people to continue to invest and take the risk of creating housing. But someone's got to meet the need where you're taking on so much risk that it doesn't make sense to go to a bank and get a traditional loan and charge rates that are going to afford that debt. And that's where subsidized housing steps in. And the form that takes place is the Housing Authority through Section 8 vouchers. That come in two forms. There are project-based vouchers that are assigned to units, and there are tenant-based vouchers that are assigned to people. Those vouchers give subsidy to offset rent that you would otherwise have to charge to afford to provide stable, clean housing. Catholic Charities is able to take long-term rental contracts for subsidy, and we leverage them for financing to build housing. And in some cases, we use what's known as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Since 1986, I believe, is when that was put into law through a Tax Reform Act. This allows for corporations to provide equity into affordable housing projects, and in return, they receive tax benefits for 10 years. Now, the cool thing about this program is the average return for an investor in a tax credit project for low-income housing is about 17%. That's a pretty good return. There's less than a 0.1% failure rate in tax credit housing across the nation. It's a great way to incentivize the private market to invest in affordable housing, and it works. Catholic Charities has developed over 14 projects in Eastern Washington alone in the last 10 years using this form of housing. In fact, Over 90% of all affordable housing in the United States has been created since 1986 using the LIHTC program. So it's a primary tool that we use to fund the construction and rehabilitation of affordable housing. The people that are in our housing, they're going to come to us with really high barriers. They're going to have extremely low incomes, often below 30% of the area median income. To give you an idea, in Spokane, for a one-person household, you're talking about someone that makes between $17,000 and $20,000, oftentimes much less than that. They are likely going to have some other challenges to their housing sustainability. It could be a physical disability. It could be just years and years of trauma that have led to conditions like substance use disorder that they're struggling to overcome. So our approach is to first opt them into housing. We don't screen them out like a for-profit landlord that says, oh, that resident's too risky, we can't accept them. Catholic Charities says, we want to get you into our housing. We want to stabilize you. We provide on-site supportive services. Those services run the gamut. They're counseling to help people process and overcome some of the trauma they've experienced in their life. They are case management to help people navigate the complex systems of support or employment that are available to those individuals. They're peer supports, people who have lived experience at being homeless, who, quite frankly, can relate to new residents in a way that professional staff members cannot. One of the things you might be surprised to learn is when we move people off the streets directly into our housing, they struggle. They struggle mightily. They, in fact, in some cases, they can't sleep in their bed. They feel like they feel guilty. They feel like they have been picked out of a lottery to be rewarded, and that their friends who are still suffering on the streets don't have that same blessing. And they need to talk to someone who's been through that in order for them to really connect with the community. But I'll tell you what we find at Catholic Charities and what I know inherently to be true: homelessness, poverty, these are isolating experiences that create you as an other in the community. When you are in a home and your dignity is being respected, and that you're making a connection with people, and you're feeling that you're part of the community and starting to see your own worth, and that worth is displayed in the beautiful settings around you because you have your own place to call your home, that is transformational. So we have all sorts of great scientifically developed and assessed programs that help improve people's wellness, reduces their reliance on emergency rooms for costly services, helps them improve their well-being, helps them overcome substance use disorder, helps them get job training to get employed. At the end of the day, it's those connections that they make with each other and with our team members, and those relationships that are the most transformative aspect. And that is what really well done, affordable, subsidized housing can be. There's not enough of it in our community. I was surprised after 5 years of decreases in chronic homelessness in Spokane, because we've been building permanent supportive housing. There was actually a significant increase of about 75% in the 2020 point in time count. And that shows you that the need is increasing. Although the housing system, the subsidized system is providing more housing at a lower cost than ever before, the inflow into homelessness is greater than the outflow. The outflow is growing. We're becoming more effective every day at putting people into housing. But the inflow, the people experiencing homelessness, is growing faster. And the net impact of that is an increase in homelessness. So we all need to take this seriously. We need to advocate for additional subsidy for affordable housing. We need to continue to push our policy leaders to embrace the reality that public affordable housing is a public good. It reduces the amount of burden on taxpayers for delivering emergency services to people who are suffering and dying on our streets. That's very costly. And putting someone in a house and giving them a safe place to live is less expensive. So if you're not inclined to buy my argument that housing people is the right thing to do because everyone deserves a home, please consider the fact that housing people is better for our economy. It's better for our taxpayers. It's better for our businesses. And there's the business case behind why people should be housed is absolutely compelling, without a doubt. So I don't have a lot of time today to go into it, but if you've got questions about that, you want to talk about that in more detail at some point, I'm available to you. subsidized housing is critical, even in a really healthy, vibrant housing system. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Terri because she's got some really important things to share with you.
Hi, I hope you can hear me now, and I apologize that my connection seemed to go off. I'm from the Tenants Union of Washington State. I direct the Spokane office, and I was beginning to tell you about our history that we started in 1977 when Seattle was starting to go through some of the causing blight, that the housing the room only were attracting crime, drugs, and chasing away people from the businesses, and they had to outlaw single room only occupancy. And they did. The city council listened to them and said, yeah.
Well, darn, poor Terri. We'll try again. Danielle, perhaps you could reach out and just give her a phone number to call in. That might be a clearer connection. Ben, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll touch base on the regulatory framework, and I can cut mine short whenever Terri gets back. I'll start by just maybe touching on some regulatory framework when we talk about market rate housing. There was a 2018 study, it's called the Kevin Bacon Housing Study, and it showed that even if you built in the Bay Area $1 million home, that 6 different levels of people moved into those homes, and it freed up middle-class housing. So all levels of housing are important, and we can't just focus on the need for low-income housing and protecting renters. If we have people in the market, the Spokane Housing Authority put some houses for sale actually last week, and they started at $220,000, which is the price that you need for an entry-level home. They got 30 offers, and the house sold for $280,000, which is outside of the price for a first-time home buyer in Spokane. You can't afford that. That was my third house, was $280,000 after I'd been working for 15 years. I can't imagine coming into the housing market or with the way that it is and skyrocketing. So we need to take a look at unintended consequences of policies. The policy I always start by talking about when we talk about unintended consequences is a popular policy, and it's called the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act was passed in 1990, and since then it has been implemented. The purpose of the GMA, as it's called, was to stop cities from spreading out and stopping sprawl. It was good for the environment. It did control sprawl. We're not like Houston, where they don't have any control out. But there are unintended consequences to cities because the legislature, when they passed the Growth Management Act, said we're going to stop cities from in urban areas from spreading out, but they made the assumption, and they said we're going to require you to pass a comprehensive plan, but they made the assumption that those comprehensive plans would be implemented. The city of Spokane has a great comprehensive plan that talks about walkable neighborhoods, talks about a centers and corridors strategy, and talks about density around those centers and corridors. But there are zero incentives for people to change things like zoning in their neighborhoods and density, because one, we all want the status quo. We bought a house in a neighborhood that has a big yard, and we don't want that to change. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And it's really, really strong in Spokane. We have a great neighborhood council system that was empowered in the mid-1990s. And what they've done is acted as a barrier to changes in each individual neighborhood. And they stop projects all the time. We've talked about, it's pretty apparent if you've been following the housing market, that prices are skyrocketing and people can't afford rents. Yet we are still stopping apartment projects in neighborhoods because single family homes neighborhoods that traditionally don't have apartments don't want apartments in their neighborhood. They think of apartments as places where poor people live, and we treat them as others. And our problem is the state has said we won't spread out, but the city has not grown up or densified at all. And it's a really hard conversation because if you go to a neighborhood and talk about new development in their neighborhood, they don't want those changes. Transitions built some really great cottage projects up in Northwest Spokane. And I sat through 3 different meetings and got yelled at by every single neighbor in that neighborhood trying to build those cottage projects. Now we have neighbors there that absolutely love them. They are all good neighbors, and it's what we hold up in videos as a good project. But it wouldn't have gotten off the ground unless everybody like Jonathan and his staff at the city dug their feet in and said, we're going to build those projects. Every time you build a project against the wishes of those neighborhoods, you risk, though, losing an election. The neighborhood councils are very powerful. It's very uncomfortable to talk about those type of things, but the growth management has to change from a voluntary implementation to a forced implementation and take away local control, because as long as there is local control and you've stopped them forcefully from growing out, we're never going to have density in our neighborhoods. Another example of a regulatory framework that I like to talk about that really creates problems, a lot of problems, is single family zoning. Single family zoning is also described as exclusionary, and because it excludes all other housing types except for houses with lawns. And we even set the regulations that say your house has to be 20% back from the street. Your house has to have room in between the house next to it and that house, and it can only be so tall. And we've even said that your single family home has to have a garage. So think about that. Cars are a private industry, and in 1952, one planner in Iowa decided to write into his city code that parking is required. Up until 1952, parking was required nowhere across the United States. But now, every single home or apartment that is built must have a parking spot. You know what a parking spot costs? $20,000 to $25,000 per parking spot. It's even more if it's a garage. Now think about the cost that adds to homes. So we have regulatory frameworks like the Growth Management Act or parking requirements or single family zoning. Cities right now are experimenting with getting rid of single family zoning. Minneapolis, Portland, the Berkeley City Council just voted 9-0 a month ago to eliminate single family zoning. And that was a huge move nationwide because the first single family zoning was actually created in Berkeley in order to create the segregation. Because if you look at the redlining maps from early in Spokane's history and overlay that with a single family zoning map, oh, they match because it excludes people from those neighborhoods financially. And we need to go towards a system where we have smart density around our business districts that force neighborhoods so that every neighborhood has mixed income neighborhoods. Mixed income neighborhoods to me are important mostly so that you can't treat people as another. That's why public transit is so great, because when you get on a bus, you're with everybody from the community. But it's really easy to demonize poor people, and especially the homeless in a community, and not treat them like community members if you treat them like an other that's part of a different community. And if we all grow up in certain neighborhoods that have large yards and everybody is upper middle class or wealthy, then you don't run into people that are different than you. And it enables us to treat people differently. And so not only does it harm our housing crisis, because those cities that are moving forward aren't just moving forward for reasons of diversity of income and mixed income neighborhoods. They're doing it because people should have choices in their neighborhood of where to live. If you live in a single family home and retire at 65, but want to downsize, you should be able to live in a duplex or a townhome. If we think about successful neighborhoods over the last that have been built out of scratch in Spokane, a really good one to look at is Kendall Yards. And Kendall Yards, if you go, there are housing variety all over. But all of those housing types that you see in Kendall Yards that have been built in the last 10 years were only built because it was a planned unit development. And planned unit developments have different rules than our single family zoning. Over 60% of the zoning in the city of Spokane is single family, and nothing that was built in Kendall Yards that has been successful can be built in any of our single family zones across the city. Those are just two examples, or three, I guess: parking, single family zoning, and the Growth Management Act. And we can talk about more, but just from, you can't build a townhome in our single family zones right now, and that doesn't help any of us, and it stifles the market. And when you stifle the market and create scarcity, then prices rise. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Terri, and I am hoping this works.
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
Okay, so you can hear me. I'm not sure if I can be seen, but that's fine.
we can hear you great though,
Okay, I
Terri.
apologize. I switched to my laptop and I'm surely hoping this works. Okay, again, talking about the importance of tenants having a say in what the policies are is what created the tenants union. When policies were adopted by the city of Seattle, leaving the tenants out, it was quickly discovered that the most important people that are that should have had a voice at that table are the people who are impacted. And that is what prompted the Tenants Union of Washington State to open in 1977. Within 4 years, the city of Seattle adopted just cause eviction ordinance, which we can talk about in a little bit, but those were the tenants who were identifying issues within the city that were causing displacement. In addition to the ending of single room only occupancy, tenants were being served no cause notices to terminate, which is very disruptive to the stability of housing, because tenants have no way of knowing if they're going to be living in the same house one day or the next. And so it's that was an important policy that they adopted. So Spokane has about population of about 220,000. Half of Spokane rents. The top 100 cities in the nation have over 50% renters, and so I think Spokane might be right at that edge there. And we are near 50% of the city of Spokane are renters. Half of those who rent in Spokane are rent burdened. That means they pay more than 30% of their monthly income in rent. Half of those, about 25,000, are severely rent burdened, meaning they pay more than 50% of their monthly income in rent. 80% of Black households are renter, or roughly about 70, I think about 76.9 or something like that, of Black households are renters. Over 60% of Indigenous people of color households are renters, and only 30% of white households in Spokane are renters. And I think that gets back to when you hear of systemic racism, I think Ben talked a little bit about the history of redlining and zoning. I'll go back even further. Spokane, and thank you for the land acknowledgement of the Spokane tribe. Spokane is founded on displacement. The executive order that removed the original inhabitants from Spokane was 1881. The founding of the city of Spokane is 1881. The years are exactly the same. So in order for the city to become a city, it had to displace the original inhabitants. Interestingly, another wave of displacement of the original inhabitants are the Spokane tribe. Many people during the executive order did not leave. They remained in the city of Spokane, and most of those tribal members lived in what we now know as Peaceful Valley. In 1974, when Expo 74 came to Spokane and they cleaned up the river and cleaned up all that area, Peaceful Valley became what I call Spokane's first gentrification, because all the remaining tribal members in that area were forced to leave. The first eviction, my best friend is a Spokane tribal member who used to always tell me the story of Spokane's first eviction. And Spokane, Chief Spokane Gary, there's a park near Gonzaga named after him. Obviously lived here, and he also traveled back east because he was educated, I believe by Jesuits, and one of his trips back east, when he went to get some education, when he came back to Spokane, there was a settler on his land, and he was forced to move, and that was the first known eviction of Spokane. He then moved what is now Peaceful Valley and became the caretaker of yet another settler in the city. So that's our history. Again, you've heard the redlining happened in when Spokane became developed. That was the practice of the day. Also, after we go even further and look into VA, when veterans came back from war after World War II and were provided housing, those were only given to white veterans, and so veterans that fought for this country that were not white did not get those benefits, and that you can see how that kind of builds into what we're looking like right now. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which, well, actually, probably court decisions prior to the Fair Housing Act, but we did also have white only housing covenants in the city of Spokane. And again, we talk about putting an overlay on the city of Spokane. You can look at the overlay of where those white housing covenants are, and those are all single family only housing zoning, and they remain pretty uh, much intact as what they looked like originally. Many of those homes were passed down to their children. Those were not actually, many of them did not get changed. Well, actually, I think the covenants are still in dispute. There's some court cases over those covenants. So even to this very day, they still talk about that. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 did prohibits housing discrimination. It also includes disparate treatment. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one individual may have been discriminated by an individual who may have denied housing. Disparate treatment can be I guess a good example of disparate treatment right now, I would say, is the fact that we have no fair chance housing laws in the city of Spokane. So if a person has a criminal record on their background, they are denied housing. Um, because of our unjust criminal justice system, those who are going to be in that position of being denied housing are more likely going to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so that would be a disparate treatment, but I don't know that that's ever been addressed as a fair housing issue, as many cities and hopefully Spokane will pass fair chance housing. Um, the things that are impacting, again, we can't talk about housing without talking about racial equity. And then we throw in the fact that we have a severe low vacancy rate right now. Some estimate below zero. And the other thing that's really that we need to know about that low vacancy rate number, if you look on any statistic, it may say Spokane has 2 or 3, maybe I've seen as high as 5%. But if you aggregate that housing by affordability, and this is true everywhere, and especially true in Seattle and King County, where they show like they have a 10% vacancy rate. Well, those are all the high-end housing. There's tons of vacancy if you want to pay $1,500, $2,000 a month rent, and you can afford it. But unfortunately, that does not, hit the communities that need it the most. Evictions. A study by University of Washington shows that Black women are evicted at the same disproportion as Black men who are being incarcerated. So you can again see when you have an eviction on your record, that's a barrier for future housing, and so the eviction rates are impact what our housing is right now. Now you throw in COVID, and we cannot talk about housing without talking about COVID-19 and what that impact had on tenants. Most again, as you know, tenants are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately the same population that you see testing disproportionately positive for COVID or working in essential work where they may be at risk of exposure or not have access to the jobs that they can work from at home, and so are also disproportionately economically impacted by COVID. And so that's why we are now facing this immediate eviction crisis once the moratorium of eviction ends. And if you are not aware, the governor issued a moratorium on evictions in early March of last year, almost 1 year ago. It may even be 1 year ago today, now that I think about it. And it has been extended several times. But once that moratorium is over, we estimate the Spokane Bar Association is estimating at least 2,500 evictions a month. They know that there have been over 1,000 early resolution notices sent to tenants who have been notified that once the moratorium expires, they can expect to be evicted immediately. Again, you can't be evicted if you're not a renter. And if 80% of the Black households in Spokane are renters, you can see how the disproportionality and the risk of homelessness has a greater impact on communities of color in Spokane. We have been working on some protections, and I think we may get to talk about a little bit of those in a little bit, but I don't want to take any more time so we can get back to Ben, if you wanted to move on. I don't want to take too much time here.
Terri, that was a great introduction. I really appreciate all that information, the statistics. And I wanted to talk a little bit about rental protection, what Spokane has in place currently, what kind of protections are out there. And then I would add on to that the question that any of the three panelists can talk about what do we have in place as far as safety nets. So we have a number of people who are housing insecure at various income levels. And what interventions are in place to try to help to keep them in their housing, whether it's rental housing or it's housing that they own. But first, Terri, if you could talk a little bit about the kind of rental protection Spokane has, that would be great.
Spokane does not have any tenant protections above and beyond the Washington Residential Landlord Tenant Act. Unfortunately, most cities in the state of Washington have adopted tenant protections, but Spokane did adopt source of income discrimination before it became a state law. So there was a time that Spokane did have one additional tenant protection, but right now we have none. And we have been working with the city prior to the moratorium. The city had developed a landlord tenant work group, and we were working through the problems and then going to move towards some solutions and then identify ordinances. But then the moratorium and the stay-at-home orders kind of halted that until we could get back going on WebEx meetings. And we haven't had a meeting probably since maybe June. And I just this week got a notice that they're going to reconvene those landlord tenant meetings again next week. We've asked the city council if they could the other thing that Spokane did that I am very proud of is that when the city of Spokane issued a moratorium even before Governor Inslee did, and our moratorium, many have told me across the nation that people all across the country were looking at the Spokane ordinance because it covered everything. And after about a month, I believe Governor Inslee then reissued his moratorium and proclamation, and it looked nearly identical to what Spokane issued. So we've asked the city if they would again enact that ordinance in the event that the moratorium is not extended. We are asking Governor Inslee to extend the moratorium through the end of July, because there's a lot of rental assistance that has been included in the recent COVID protection. There's state money. It just feels like there's some help on the way. But if we don't get that moratorium extended, people are going to fall off the cliff before they even get a chance to get their landlords repaid from the back rent. So we're kind of in a sense of urgency right now because we only have like 3 weeks before the moratorium ends. So we're scrambling to get some state legislation passed and for the city to also do some protections in the event the state doesn't.
Then I'd just say we're so far behind the rest of Washington State that I was applying. Somebody sent me a grant to work on housing and form a group, and Washington was actually exempt from receiving the grant because they said Washington cities have such strong tenant protections in place. So we can't work on tenant protections and other housing issues with these national organizations because they think that we're all the West Side, and Seattle does have really strong tenant protections in place. But it's fascinating that over here we don't have them in place.
And when we talk about the tenant rights, please correct me if I'm wrong or help explain. It really needs to be both the just cause eviction and some sort of rental control. Is that correct? And can you unpack what those mean? And maybe help share with the students having no tenant protections, what that means for the tenant, like what can happen to a person who's renting.
Well, without tenant protections, we have a no cause termination in the state of Washington. So we see that in Spokane, landlords don't offer term leases, because if they offer term leases, then they can't serve a 20-day no cause notice on a tenant. It's really caused problems in the city. Tenants that get housing choice vouchers can't use them because they are required to get a 1-year lease on the first year of their tenancy, and they are unable to find landlords in Spokane who will offer a 1-year lease. And the reason is because landlords have learned that if they have month-to-month tenancies, the only thing they need to do in order to evict, and I don't like to use the word evict, because a no cause notice is not an eviction, and so many tenants get a no cause notice and they think they've been evicted. No, they've not been evicted, they've been terminated, and they don't have a right to challenge it, because there's no real due process for challenging no cause. I mean, you can't defend no cause. And so that's the fear. Yes, when we also believe that rent control and just cause have to go hand in hand, because we see in areas that have rent control without just cause, they just give a just cause notice. If you have just cause and no rent control, then they can just double your rent with a 60-day notice. I would argue that the 60-day notice was probably the only rent control that we have in the state of Washington. And that is 3 years ago, Washington extended the notice period for rent increases from 30 days to 60 days. But that also puts tenants on month-to-month tenancies even more at risk, because why would a landlord give a 60-day notice to somebody to give them a rent increase that they know they can't afford to live in, when they can just give them a 20-day notice and get them out, and then raise the rent when the new tenant moves in? And that's really the practice in Spokane. We see entire buildings get cleared out because a new owner wants to raise the rent, wants to put a few countertops, paint some walls, and double the rent. And in order to do that, they serve 20-day notices on every tenant in the building. It really is a barrier for tenants to request repairs, because they feel that they ask one too many times, their landlord's going to get too frustrated with them, and rather than repair, just serve a no cause notice, which is very common right now. So that is probably the biggest thing that we see, that the consequences to tenants. And I also sit on I've been participating in the housing action plan that our planner is doing. And on the displacement map of the city of Spokane, and that displacement means, foreclosure, evictions, displacement, rent increase that forces you to move, all of those things. And in displacement, 38% displacement comes in homeowners, and 62% of our displacement comes in rental housing. So that shows you what lack of tenant protections do.
I as a landlord, I mean, so Catholic Charities is a landlord in providing our housing, and I, personally, I'm also a landlord, and I think one of the conceptions I hear frequently is that rent control and tenants' rights is going to drive people out of the business of being a landlord, and just the economics of that don't really make sense to me, because as long as rent control considers items like inflation, you're really accounting for those factors that are outside of the control of a landlord, to provide that housing. So if you can have a reasonable increase in rent on an annual basis that also accounts for inflation, and that the government doesn't increase property taxes beyond the rate of someone's ability to increase their rent, you're still going to be able to finance that housing. The opportunity for profit is there. And tenant protections are good for a housing system. I mean, it is not healthy to have people become unhoused and housed on a frequent basis. As a landlord, it's good for me to have people in that house for as long as I possibly can. I want them to be happy. I want them to give them a great, safe place to live that they want to continue to pay rent. It's expensive when people move. You have a couple months of lost revenue. You've got to go in and do more work than you otherwise would. I think rent control and tenant protections are absolutely positive factors in our housing ecosystem. And I would just say, even though there are no legal reasons outside of in Spokane, you know, lots of landlords, including Catholic Charities, are taking the position that you should have just cause, and that you should not evict someone when COVID-19 crisis is dissipates because they have unpaid rent. That you know, we have made a commitment that any resident with an unpaid balance, no one will be evicted simply because they can't afford the rent from a Catholic Charities property.
And I guess one of the missing pieces here is a relocation program, because you can't stop somebody from buying property, tearing it down, and building new property. And that's what happens when your scarcity is so much that you can build bigger buildings and taller buildings with more units in them. But we have zero relocation program. In most large communities of our size, the municipality and the county will put in money in a fund, and then that'll be matched by the landlord that's removing people to build new buildings. And we have nothing like that. And we've seen for a while there about, it's not happening during COVID because all those relocations have stopped. But before COVID, we were seeing about one a month in Spokane, where the smaller units on the lower South Hill that were real affordable for people were getting bought up, and then people were being removed because they were building new units there to get more density on those units. But we have no program to help relocate them. And in other communities, you'll get a $5,000 to $8,000 stipend to find a new place, and they actually hire relocation specialists to help you find those locations. And that's something, if you think about like group homes for disabled, the ARC in Spokane has group homes for disabled individuals, and they are having a hard time finding units available for group homes right now. And there's like several different pockets of our community that are really getting left behind because we just don't even have relocation program. Something as simple as a relocation program. Like, you have tiered different tenant supports. Like, we don't have minimum housing rental standards. The city came out with a great report with a great sample ordinance, and the pushback was awful on somebody saying we should have minimal living standards for people in our community. I guess me personally, I feel like, and in order to have minimal standards, you'd have to have a rental registry. We require every business in Spokane to register their business, but we don't require landlords to register as a business. So we don't have the minimal standards. Like, rent controls up here, but you could at least require people to get a business license so that we can then enforce minimum living standards, but we don't even do that.
So
I'd also like to add that the Northwest Fair Housing Alliance was contracted by the city of Spokane to do an analysis of impediments to fair housing. And they make the impediments to fair housing, and they make recommendations. And one of the impediments, and I believe it's like the second or third, is that there are no tenant protections in the city of Spokane, and we have a greater racial divide in home ownership, which means that puts a greater risk on communities of color, but also people with disabilities are disproportionately renting and are also disproportionately unprotected because of those tenant protections. Those are two protected categories under the Fair Housing Act. And so the recommendation is that the city of Spokane enact a just cause ordinance and other tenant protections, but so far has not done so.
So I'm going to open to questions with the raise hand feature. A number of questions have been asked in chat, many of which have been answered in chat as well. So as I open up, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. But I did want to ask sort of one more question to go back to something that Ben was talking about. I think it touches what Jonathan was talking about as well. And one of the challenges we have in Spokane seems to be that we don't have robust mixed use neighborhoods. And so we have these single family neighborhoods, and even where we've tried to make the centers and corridors work, I think about like the Perry district. A lot of the Perry district business is people coming from outside of the Perry district. So you're adding traffic and things like that because there isn't the density there to support some of that. And so there's often, all three of you have talked some about sort of the NIMBYism or the not wanting to have these mixed use, mixed income housing, more dense housing in neighborhoods. And I would love to hear a little bit about the value, that the community value, the economic value of those sorts of neighborhoods.
Ben, I'd love for you to take this one, but can I just give a little factoid to kick it off? So I'll tell you what is really inequitable about single family neighborhoods that drives me nuts. You know, people who live in single family neighborhoods like I do have a belief that they are the tax base for cities, and that the services and the taxes they pay are provided to the entire city, and that they are the primary source of revenue. That's categorically false. Cities lose money on single family neighborhoods. So people who live in single family neighborhoods, which are generally wealthier families, are actually being subsidized by more dense, poorer neighborhoods elsewhere in the city. Yet they resist and have the power to prevent dense dense development in their neighborhoods. And that inequity, that injustice is prevalent not just in Spokane, but across our nation. And it wasn't done by design. It was done inadvertently after World War II and lots of cheap financing for these suburban developments. But it is definitely a problem today. And if we don't call that inequity out, we're never going to solve that problem.
So, Adriane, you pointed out Perry District, and Perry District had a really good bloom, right, when we improved the walkability, and it plateaued 3 years ago, and there are empty buildings there. And the reason is because 3/4 of the Perry Business District is surrounded by single family housing. South, north of it is multifamily, but a business district, you could draw a map in Spokane around our 28 centers and corridors. So think Monroe, think Perry, think Manitou Shopping Center. They should have a 2-block radius where developers can build density around those. You actually have some of them, like Lincoln Heights is built right. You have the density. And the reason it's important that you have the density around your business centers is, I think there's really 5 reasons. One is safety, because if people are out and about, you have more people, so more people are going to be out and about walking. Eyes on the street are 10 times better than any number of police officers. If you have an environment where everybody is out walking, it is safer. When we did the street improvements on Sprague, crime decreased by 50% within 12 months. And that's because more people were living on Sprague because we incentivized low-income housing as we developed it in order to hedge against gentrification. It's good for business. Sprague is also an example that if you create the walkable environment, you increase business. And that's just pure science. Is if you have more people living there, you're going to have more businesses. And that's the only way they're going to survive. Because if you require people to drive to a business district, it cannot survive long-term. Perry cannot survive long-term surrounded by all single-family homes. We just spent $8 million as a city on Monroe, yet it's surrounded by single-family homes. And you had 24 new businesses open up and down the Monroe Street corridor after we improved the walkability. But those are going to start dying out in 10 years if we don't increase the density around it. It's also, I talked about this earlier, and to me, it's my most important value is the mixed income neighborhoods, and putting density in every neighborhood actually doesn't allow you to create the other and creates diversity of incomes. And so you are surrounding yourself with people different than you, and you then create a more just society. It's healthier for the individual, because when you have density, people walk more. And that's just a fact of the matter. If you're around a business district and you're going to be walking more, it's healthier for the individual. And then finally, because people aren't driving as much and their services are near them, it's healthier for our environment. There is not a good argument around a business district to create those layers of density. The city could take a map right now and solve this within 6 months. And there just isn't the political will because of what we talked about with NIMBYism in our community. But the argument has to keep being made if we're going to make a difference. It is like, we're not spreading out, so we better densify, or we're just going to continue to have a crisis and continue stepping on ourselves. Because we can build, just as you have to take care of the people at the bottom, and you have to build those low-income housing, and you have to take care of the people in the renters. We have to remember that you could build as much low-income housing as you want, and you can protect the people in apartments. But if there aren't enough apartments and not enough houses for people in our community or places for them to live, those prices due to scarcity are going to continue to rise.
And from the tenants' perspective, what we're seeing in Spokane and why we believe that we do need more housing density is what ends up happening is the apartments get concentrated in certain parts of town. Go past, 55th or whatever, 40 or 50. Whatever, 47th, around up in those areas up in Regal. There's just massive apartment buildings there. North Nevada, massive apartment buildings. What that means is tenants cannot live in areas where they can get to work easily. People should live in neighborhoods where they can send their kids to the schools in the neighborhoods. When you are pushing out people in apartments and in multifamily housing, they aren't part of those neighborhoods and part of that community. When you look at neighborhoods that do have density, you see a community. And that's what we want in Spokane. We want a community. We don't want housing for single family housing where they don't even hardly know each other. And then you cram all the apartments all around the edges of town or force people to live in airway heights. I mean, that's what lack of housing density is doing. And that is exactly what it's looking like. And you don't have to drive very far in Spokane to see it.
So someone had their hand up, but they put it down. I want to read one of the questions that's tied to what we've been discussing in the chat, in case not everyone can see it. But we were asked, can anyone quantify the problem caused by lack of just cause eviction? We talk about it a lot, but is there a number? Like, how big of a problem is this? I think is the question, especially given, as was pointed out, the expenses in getting a new tenant.
Well, we believe we quantify it by hearing the tenant stories. That is another one of the real insidious dangers that lurks behind a 20-day notice, is that there is no way to count them. The only people that see them are the tenant. They don't have to file them with the city. They don't have to file them with the court. And since it's a 20-day termination letter, meaning you leave in 20 days or you get evicted, most tenants have learned that getting an eviction on your record will actually create more barriers. So they will leave in those 20 days. That doesn't necessarily mean they have a place to move to. And in most likelihood, they do not. And so they move into homelessness. So then that just adds more to our homelessness problem. And again, I don't know how you quantify it, but look around the city, you'd see it. And you can hear it if you ask tenants to tell their stories. These no-cause notices cause homelessness, displacement, and there's no way to statistically measure and count them. That's why they're so bad.
Yeah, I think Terri is absolutely right, and I would echo that the human impact. When you hear those anecdotes and those stories, you only have to hear a couple before you'd really want to pursue these policies. But I'd give an anecdotal measure of the impact of not having these rental protections, and this comes from our school district. In some of our poorer schools, you would see a huge spike in turnover in classrooms by over 50% in that winter period of kids who had to exit the classrooms. And what was happening was they were in housing and unable to afford their utilities, because you'd have a big spike of utilities when the weather got cold, and they would be evicted because landlords under the law are responsible for all utility payments. Well, that eviction displaced them from their school, and that it really translates into down the road challenges. And so those economic measures of those kids who are displaced mid-school year, you start seeing lower educational attainment, a 20% decrease in expected income, and some measures like that. So I think I don't have hard data on specifically just cause, but I can tell you those impacts of housing instability that are in housing instability being increased by not having just cause have significant ramifications over the long run in someone's life.
So the hand was raised, went down. So please feel free to continue to raise hands. But I think this is a big topic, and there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of intersecting parts that add to the complexity. What can we do? What are some tangible things that we can do to be a part of the solution?
There's a House Bill 1236 in the Washington State Legislature right now that talks about the cause evictions. Terri, is that being heard this week?
Tomorrow, House Bill 1236 is being voted by there'll be an executive session for the Housing Committee in the Senate. And if it gets through the Senate committee, then it will go to the floor of the Senate. And I don't know if that's next week or the week after, but they have had hearings, and it did pass the House last week.
So it passed the House, it's in the Senate. Can somebody sign in and support tonight?
No, but you can write to the committee members. The committee members are voting tomorrow. It's the Housing and Human Services Committee in the Senate. And every member can be located in the legislature finder thing. And we actually have an action alert, and I can send it to everybody that we are sending letters to every member of the committee. I believe there are 4 statewide tenant advocacy organizations that have action alerts on 1236. And one is to the committee members. We believe it will make it into the House. We're very hopeful it will pass the committee. We are very worried about it when it gets to the floor. We don't want amendments that continue to weaken it. It went through the House, and several amendments were placed on it that weaken it. And the one thing that we could do in Spokane is we could still pass a just cause eviction ordinance in the city. Seattle, Burien, Federal Way, and Auburn all have just cause eviction ordinances. And what makes them better, I think, when a city enacts an ordinance is that a city can also enact an enforcement piece to it. So if it's just a state law, you can use it when you go to court if you get served one, if you know about it. But if we make it as a city ordinance, then the city could actually enforce it. And I believe we had in the draft ordinance, there is an enforcement mechanism where the city could invalidate those notices so that tenants could take that letter and not be evicted even after they've been served a notice. So we still would like to see the city enact just cause, even if the state does pass 1236.
And if people can't contact the legislature tonight, there's also a group of Gonzaga students called Humanizing Spokane. They're filming a documentary that'll be released in late April. They are going to watch for information about Humanizing Spokane. They're going to have a march on April 24th and participate in that march because they're going to be making some demands around just cause and some of the regulations that I talked about. But these students are very organized. They're filming a very professional documentary. Terri and I have both met with them multiple times. But it's April 24th. There'll be a march by Gonzaga, led by the Gonzaga students. And I think that the louder their voice is too, the better we're going to get change.
So
And we'll be joining them. There's also a whole suite of ordinances that the city has proposed because just cause is not enough. One of the things that the city is proposing, which I think would be awesome, is to extend the notice period for rent increases. Currently, state law says 60 days. The city is proposing that we have a 90-day notice period for rent increases. Again, that isn't rent control, but it does limit the amount of rent increases that a landlord can give in a year. So in that way, it does limit the cost of rent. And then there's also ordinances that cover universal applications for rental applications. If anybody's ever tried to rent, you know that sometimes you can pay anywhere from $40 to $60 just to turn in an application. That doesn't mean you're going to get approved. You know, I've talked to tenants that literally budget 5 rent applications a month because that's all they can afford. And the city is proposing we have a universal application that tenants can use multiple times to limit the cost. Also, the city is proposing that tenants can have a breakdown and not pay all the move-in costs at one time. Although that is also a state law, but I think the city's ordinance again is easier to enforce, and I believe is even better written than the state law. So the city has been talking about them, and I think it's going to take, again, like Ben said, the political will often happens when pressure is put upon the people. And so we need to start putting more pressure on our lawmakers. There is an election coming up next fall for city council members. And I would say talk to the candidates who are running for city council. Tell them that you want them to pursue more ordinances, because that's another way we can get some change made. So we also believe that tenant protections increase democracy. One of the other ordinances that we're asking for is that landlords provide a packet, and in that packet, not only do they know what their rights are, what services and resources are available, but it also includes a voter change of address or a voter registration packet. I can't tell you how many times I've heard under the voices of people who probably didn't think I heard them say, well, tenants don't vote. Well, you know, it's hard to vote when you're getting a no-cause notice, 3 times a year and you're moving all the time. And so we can make that happen. So, and then if we get more tenants that are voting, maybe we will have more influence on our local politics. But any influence anybody has to either convince our current council or talk to the folks that are running for council, so we can get that political will, and we will have the will to move forward and do these things.
Then I added my email address. It's just bensteckert@gmail.com. I put out a weekly legislative alert that includes a lot of tenant protections, a lot of low-income housing subsidy issues at the federal and state level, and also the regulatory changes I talked about. And I put that out every Friday. So if you want to be on that email list, you can just email me. But as we move forward with tenant protections at the city level too, that alert will include city actions. And then keep an eye out for this summer. There will be, at least the Low Income Housing Consortium will be doing a housing forum for the electoral candidates to make sure we're at least aware of what everybody's opinions are on housing issues.
So Mike put his hand back down again. There is a great question in the chat, but I also want to be cognizant of everyone's time. And I think any of the folks here could help with that. Ben, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, is this Adriane's question?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so actually I think I go back to the 5 reasons why density actually helps businesses and other issues. And we won't have strong business districts, and that's why a lot of our business districts fluctuate, because we don't have density near them. And if we think about the fastest growing price values in Spokane over the last 20 years, it was Perry when it was peaking, but it's no longer because it plateaued. But if you strengthen a business district and keep it long-term, you're actually protecting your investment, because people want to live near those small business districts. So that and the other thing is I have not seen any, I've heard that argument before, but nobody's ever been able to show me compelling evidence that if we do it right, you're right, price values will fall if we just take, like we did in East Central and West Central, and we said the entire areas are multifamily. But that was to continue the segregation with single family outside, and we're going to take the poor areas of town that are already poor and put all of the multifamily in one area. And so in that instance, when we don't do it smartly, yes, your property values decrease if you have a single family home in West Central and they plop multifamily over the whole neighborhood. But your price values will increase as the business districts are strengthened if we do it smartly, which is why we always need to look at what those unintended consequences are. We can't say we have a housing shortage, so we should build massive apartments that are 20 stories high everywhere in town, but we can sure put density in the right places that strengthen our business districts.
Franklin, you have your hand up. You have a quick question for the group?
Yes, I do. On this particular subject, I'm interested in understanding better how it is that density near a business district, if we're talking about low-income housing, how that low-income density is going to help that business district. I don't understand that.
So it's got to be a mix. It can't just be low-income housing near a business district. When I'm talking about zoning, I'm saying you're allowing multifamily in those areas that are now only single family. And so you could build multifamily low income or multifamily market rate. Both work though. Sprague actually saw an increase in 25% in sales tax revenue and saw 13 new businesses. And the only new housing in that area were 2 low-income housing projects. But you have to have a mix. You can't just say we're only going to, and I'm not making the argument that we should only build low-income housing near our small business districts. I'm saying we need to build dense housing near our small business districts. So that's a great question.
I would also like to add that, low-income housing, for the same reason than my initial example about single room only occupancy in downtown Seattle, those businesses valued those tenants because often lower income tenants don't drive an automobile. So they're going to shop in their neighborhood where they live. Maybe they're going to spend 100% of their disposable income in that neighborhood or more there than, because they're not going to be driving to a shopping center in another neighborhood. And I think people forget the value of the economic contribution of low-income tenants and tenants in general in in Spokane. Tenants very much contribute to our economy, and the only reason that tenants can't as much as we'd like to is because the rent's too high.
And the minimum wage is really you can be working 32 hours a week and qualify for low-income housing. So there's the working poor that are affected by a low minimum wage and a service industry that we have when we lost 40% of our manufacturing over the last 40 years. And we've really created a service industry that pays minimum wage. So then they used to maybe, when I worked in the restaurant industry, I could survive living on the lower South Hill with the cheap rent. But now you go and you work in the service industry and you can't. You actually qualify for low-income housing that we don't have. So our minimum wage plays into this.
And tenants who live in HUD Section 8 project-based housing, which we really need to preserve as much as we can, because those will never be replaced. Tenants in those buildings only pay 30% of their monthly income on rent. And so they do have the ability to spend money outside of just the rent. That's why we like affordable housing, because tenants do have income outside of just, paying the rent.
Yes, and I think Ben brings up an important point that's adjacent to also thinking about how do we attract more business to Spokane if we don't have housing that's affordable for the people who are going to work for those businesses. And that's another strain that we have is we just don't have the housing for new, bigger business to relocate in the area, which makes it a challenge. Mike, you had your hand up a couple of times, so we'll try to address your question really quickly, trying to be aware of time, but I do want to hear from you, Mike, so please ask your question.
Well, thank you so much for this is a great forum. I am a developer and I have developed townhouses here in Spokane and single family homes, and I also have done some condominiums and apartment complexes here. I love, all this, conversation, but there are some stuff is happening and the dynamic of our economy is changing, and e-commerce is impacting small businesses. And we just noticed, with this COVID, how much, small businesses are closing due to e-commerce. And as I like to, just, see what do you guys, think of, e-commerce impacting our here local economy. And also, when we have, Amazons, they move here, they hire employees and they pay minimum wage. Those minimum wage salaries, they don't contribute, as much as, if we have, let's say, salaries, they're $25, $30 an hour. So that's also, is impacting, in our rental market, on our infrastructure here. But what do they contribute? So I just want to make these comments. And thank you.
I appreciate those, and I'm going to make the argument that the way to strengthen our small businesses is density around our small business centers. That will help strengthen them, and we need to be better urban planners. We need to build a better environment. The built environment isn't just where you live, it's where you work. And if we want those businesses to survive, it's an individual choice on all of us to not just pick up our phone and order something on Amazon. It's to go, but we also have to create a place where you feel comfortable walking out your front door and can get 15-minute walkability neighborhoods. That's like the real buzzword is 15-minute walkable neighborhoods. You should be able to walk out your front door and go get something at a small business near you. And that is a way to strengthen those small businesses and hedge against the Amazons of the world. I don't have another good solution though, because man, they're just building another facility out in the valley. And oh, I just feel awful for all the small businesses, restaurants included, during COVID that are getting hit with everything else. Just yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Well, thank you all. This has been a great panel. So much more to talk about, but thank you for some action items that we can enact as well. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dean Anderson for a few parting words.
Well, thank you, Adriane, and thanks to everyone for attending tonight. Our next event of this type will be our Piggott Lecture on Entrepreneurship, featuring a well-known Spokane figure, Tom Simpson. He'll be talking about the evolution of a firm called Caspian, which you may better recognize as formerly known as E-Tails. And if you can go into the Wayback Machine, you may even recognize them as Green Cupboards, originally back in the day. And that'll be on April 7th, again, presented via Zoom. And moving throughout the spring into the summer and the fall, the business school will be celebrating its centennial. Believe it or not, 100 years for the business school. And so we'll be having lots of good events coming your way as we move through the rest of 2021 and into 2022. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank, again, everybody for coming tonight. I want to thank the Mozilo family for their sponsorship of this event, as well as the Mozilo Chair of Business Administration, Danielle Xu. And I want to thank Adriane for a wonderful job moderating and keeping the conversation going. And most of all, I want to thank Ben and Jonathan and Terri for great conversation and lots of good information. And we hope to see you at our next event. So be safe out there. And again, thank you very much.